So this was the fifth of my sabbaticals. The first one in 1994, then 2002, then 2007, and 2015. And I am absolutely sure there will be no more. Obviously, it's related to a 7-year sequence in ministry. If you're very good at maths, you'll realize those weren't exactly synchronized, but it was to do with different things that were going on in the different churches I was serving. But this last 3 months has been my last and has been one of the most special. Sabbaticals are based on the idea of the Shabbat, or the Sabbath, where there can be a space for us to be able as ministers to catch up with ourselves, to catch up with God, and also maybe to catch up with others who we know and love and spend quality time with them. And I've been able to do all of that. You'll be aware, and there are a few of you who are on Facebook with me, that there's been rather a lot of traveling. Some of the traveling has been a little demanding. I would just say, and this is direct advice from your minister, be careful using EasyJet and be careful using Gatwick Airport. Of all the airlines, EasyJet was the most disorganized, and of all the airports, Gatwick was the most chaotic. Can you imagine arriving in a rental car at Munich Airport and you get a text to say your flight has been cancelled, and when you arrive at the airport you find that the EasyJet desk is closed and there is somebody from another desk who's informing you that they can get you home in 4 days' time? I was a little taken aback. Eventually, we managed with my friend to come back via Manchester. The saga continued. As we got on the train at Manchester, we got as far as just north of Stafford, and the train hit something. British Transport Police came and inspected the track, and then eventually they decided that the train would not go any further than Stafford, and then we had a bus from Stafford to Euston, and 2 taxis arranged by Avanti to take home 200 people to various parts of London. So instead of arriving at midnight, I actually arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning at Euston in the middle of complete mayhem. So sometimes traveling at the moment is particularly challenging. But having said that, there were some wonderful moments. Some of you will know, I hope this is not too much of a revelation for you, that occasionally, and during my leave, I do have a link with Jules Verne, a travel company, and they do use me as a tour manager. And they did contact me and ask whether I would be available to go on a couple of their cruises through the course of the summer. And it's very difficult to say no, isn't it, when you're offered an expenses-paid cruise. And I knew that what I needed to do was traveling and reading, and of course you can read on a boat. So I was indebted to Jules Verne for providing some of the opportunity to travel. I'll be talking a bit more over forthcoming Sundays about some of the things that I learned from God, but there's a couple of things just to draw out at the very beginning. And there were moments of unlikely ministry. I would just like to say to you, whatever you're doing in life, whether you are called to be a minister or not, if you commit your travel plans to God, and you remember I was prayed over by Derek and Diane, and that I would meet God and be able to demonstrate God's presence in that last service, you get some very unusual moments. So on one of the cruises, which was in the south of France, we ended up in the town of Montpellier. And I was walking around the cathedral. We were just having a general look around, and I was trying to provide a bit of information about it. And a Sikh lady, who lives in Birmingham, she came up to me. I have been completely open with the fact that my main job is a minister. And as we're walking around this cathedral, she said, "Philip," she said, "I need to tell you something. I had a vision in the last 6 months of Jesus, and he told me that he should be my guru. What do I do with this? My husband thinks it's nonsense, but what do you make of this?" I'm thinking like, okay, it's good that Jules Verne knows that I'm a minister. I'm just going to go for this, And so she is actually now following the teaching of this church. So she said, "I'd like to link in and watch some of the teaching on YouTube." The thing is, there are moments when suddenly you're able to minister and you're in a context maybe where people are on holiday, where their guard is down, they're happy to talk freely, and then you can actually present the word of life. There was a moment of unexpected revelation, and I will talk more about this on Sunday morning, when on the other cruise, when I was in Portugal, an Orthodox Jewish man at the lunch table started talking to me about my sense of call. And he would not let it go that I needed to recognize, because I was talking about, well, what's going to happen when I retire? And he kept saying, he said, Philip, he said, you've got to remember that your call is irrevocable. And God has called you, and he's not going to renege on this. And even when you retire, as a minister, you are still going to be ministering. And even if you're doing work for Jules Verne, you will have moments like this, speaking to a random Jewish man, and the Holy Spirit will be speaking to you. I'm thinking like, what on earth? You think like, how did this happen? And we ended up having a very long conversation. So there were moments again, and my mind, this was the week after I left you, my mind went back again to that moment when Derek and Diana prayed over me. I've had the next image. So there were moments, obviously, of great tranquility, and I will refer to this later as well, but this was some time I had in New England. Many of you will know that I've had a very strong connection to a church and particularly to a family in New Hampshire, northern New Hampshire, a little town called Lebanon, which is quite close to Hanover, where Dartmouth College, an Ivy League college that you may have heard of, is based. This is Mascoma Lake, just at the very end of the day, and you can see the autumn colors accentuated really by the sun beginning to go down. I went there first in 1994. And the family that housed me kind of took me in. And they became a place really of solace and encouragement. And many of you know that I struggled with burnout at the end of my ministry at Willesden. And so the church encouraged me to spend all my 3 months of my second sabbatical in 2002 in this context. If we have the next image, please. And so I went to stay with Don and Irma at that time, visited them again in my sabbatical of 2007. And most years I've gone out in early October. If you want to see the colors, you have to time it well. You might be doing leaf peeping one week and twig peeping the next week, because the leaves peak in a few days and then are gone. And so I knew that the first week of October was a good time to go, and when I knew that I'd been granted sabbatical, I wanted to go and spend some quality time with Irma. Don died in 2011, and it's actually while I was there, and I had the privilege of conducting his funeral. And Irma is now 91, and her family said to me, we want you to come as soon as possible. So I thought this was a good opportunity, and you'll see we were there together. A friend had also come with us. And the meeting on the Sunday was so poignant. I held her hand, I talked to her because she's been like a mother to me, and she's seen me in some of my lowest moments. She didn't want to presume, but I said, and you've got to sometimes have these conversations. I said, Irma, I'm coming out when it's the service, when you pass. And she said, in the light of that, she said, I will tell my family I want you to do the funeral. And it was a very special and moving moment to be in that context. And so there were these moments throughout where I just felt connected more deeply to God, connected more deeply to what God wants me to do. As a minister, you can be lost sometimes in the busyness of the doing rather than the reason why you're doing. There was a need for me, I think, to connect with myself, and there was lots of space to rest, to read, to pray, to shop, to eat, and to spend time with people that I love. Now, you'll be aware that part of this has been a study element. I did actually speak to somebody a little while ago, and somebody nothing connected to church life at all, and that explains the comment. And they said, I understand you're studying for these 3 months. What are you studying? And I said, I'm studying church architecture. And he looked at me directly. I think it might have been because he was from South London. And he said, how nerdy is that? And I just simply looked at him and said, guilty as charged. you know. So the point is really what we're going to do over a few moments, and there is a danger that you'll glaze, I'm sure, except for a few people. Jonathan Crawford, who I know very well, who's fascinated by buildings, even though he has to regularly go in and out of them as a funeral director. But some people are transfixed by architecture, and some people are certainly not. But I will try to do my best to make it interesting. So let's talk about church architecture. And first of all, a historical overview. Because we realize that churches, they often look a certain way, but they don't all look exactly the same. They have different styles, different patterns, different layouts. That hasn't happened by accident. It's been a journey. And it starts pretty early. And this will scare you when you see all these different photographs of all over Europe and some of the states and thinking, good gracious me, he saw all of these places in the last 3 months. No wonder he was hardly ever at home, as Aaron did tell you from time to time. So this one is Maison Carrée in Nîmes. Nîmes in the south of France. It is actually the most perfectly preserved temple from the Roman period in Europe, with the exception of the Pantheon in Rome. It was actually built to celebrate Gaius, one of the sons of Augustus, becoming recognized as a god. The reason why it's up here is it later became a church, and that's why it still exists. And the point that I wanted to make is our buildings go all the way back to the Roman period. In the Roman period, of course, when the church was persecuted, people met in homes. And so they didn't have designated buildings. But once Constantine became, if you like, the official Christian emperor, he borrowed Roman styles. You may have heard the word basilica. A basilica was a Roman meeting house, a long hall, columns down both sides with 2 aisles and a rounded end. Sounds familiar. If you want a good example, go to St. James, the big building that's always putting on concerts on the way into Leicester. That's almost like a copy of one of those Roman buildings. So initially, they kind of looked like Roman buildings, but then they began to develop their own character. So have the next one. So I've used the word Gothic. Most people now think of the word Gothic as related to Halloween, too much makeup, and wearing unusual black clothes. But actually, the word Gothic was a put-down term for this style of architecture that grew throughout Europe in the medieval period. And again, without being too technical, it's particularly associated with the pointed arch. That really defines Gothic. But sometimes it's also the vault, which is an expression of an arch. And sometimes people say, even aesthetically, a Gothic building, I rather like this, is like hands reached out in prayer to God. It's all about a kind of a reaching out to God and inviting God down to us. So the buildings that you see in front of you, and the one on the left, now, any smart Alex, this is in Yorkshire, and it's not York Minster, but it's a pretty good copy. No. Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. Beverley Minster. So I did go up there for the day. I've been there before, and I have to say to you, and Beverley actually is a really nice town. Beverley's only about 2 hours in the car from here, but it's an extraordinary medieval building. Let's read the others and we'll come back to Beverley. The top one is Montpellier Cathedral. Now, not Montpellier in Vermont, but it's the original Montpellier, which is in the south of France. And when you look at it, it looks like it's got a couple of rockets on the front. It's a most peculiar-looking building. It was built in the middle of the medieval period, and it's built to look almost like a castle. Why? Because the cathedrals in that part of France were involved in the Cathar Crusade. There was a lot of fighting going on, and so the cathedrals sometimes doubled up as castles. The building on the bottom far corner is the Dome, the cathedral, Catholic cathedral in Vienna. And that is late Gothic, see, very fancy and decorative. And then we come to Beverley on the left-hand side, on my left, and that is what sometimes is described as a perpendicular Gothic. So it's late. It's about 14th, 15th century, and it's a very grand building. And the little one in the middle is actually the interior vault of Salamanca Cathedral, which is in Spain. This is built in the 16th century. The 16th century is when Gothic begins to fade out. It goes out of taste. It's around the time of the Reformation, but more important, the Renaissance. Next. And the Renaissance, if you know anything about it, is, if you like, a revisiting of the wonder of Greece and Rome. And everything Greek and Roman was kind of being explored, including their buildings. There was a man called Vitruvius, Roman architect, and he was represented by an Italian guy you may have heard of called Palladio, hence Palladian buildings. And around that time, buildings around Europe began to be developed in a classical style, so with columns and pediments, some of them almost looking a bit like Greek temples or Roman temples. And this covers the period, if you like, from around 1650 through to about 1800. The building up there is one of these huge, the previous one is Ottoburen, which is a large pilgrimage abbey, which is in southern Germany. We go on to the next slide. And you've got a real smorgasbord there of stuff. Now, two other terms. I hope I'm not driving you nuts. Baroque. After they began to explore the classical, everything went on heat. So the first thing on heat was Baroque, which actually comes from the Portuguese word roca, which means misshapen piece. And so the buildings became a bit more theatrical. So they were classical, but they didn't really look like a Roman temple. They just took some inference, if you like, some encouragement from them. In Britain, St. Paul's Cathedral, Blenheim Palace. The Theatine Kirche on the right-hand side is in Munich. That's an example. The other buildings are even from a slightly later period called Rococo, which is even more flamboyant, and we'll come back to that later. The top one is the Peterkirche, which is in Vienna. The bottom one on the left is the pilgrimage church in Lamego in Portugal. I'll tell you a daft story, by the way. That was on one of the Jules Verne cruises, and the previous tour manager, she said, everybody wants to walk up the steps of Lamego. Why? Because what's her name? MacDonald. What's the singer? Jane MacDonald had walked up them and sung them, thinking like, no interest in the building whatsoever. I just need to not walk in the steps of Jesus, I need to walk in the steps of Jane MacDonald, anyway. And then the building on the other side is Melk Abbey, which is in Austria, sits on a big escarpment above the Danube. Keeping moving on, right, the next lot. So revivalist, so we're coming up to the modern period. So you get to the end of the 18th century, and then it's press repeat button, put crudely. So we'll go back to earlier styles. So the building that you see there is the Nikolaikirche, St. Nicholas Church, which is in Potsdam, which is quite close to Berlin, and it was built by a guy called Schinkel. Now, Schinkel is nobody to us, but he's Germany's Sir Christopher Wren. He built most of Berlin until the RAF decided to rearrange his buildings. And they're still rebuilding, I kid you not. One of his main buildings is part rebuilt right in the center of Berlin, opposite the city palace. So some of these buildings are being reconstructed with his statue in front. If you look at that, it is called neoclassical. In other words, it's going back to the classicism of the 16th century and then even earlier. So the front looks like a Greek temple, doesn't it? But the rest of it kind of looks like St. Paul's on speed. Right, and then if we look at the next set of images, three more examples of revivals. So the bottom corner, right, is the Franzischer Dom, the French cathedral, which is in Berlin, which is neoclassical. The building on the left is the Berliner Dom, the Berlin cathedral. That was built about 1900. And that's kind of everything. By the time you get to 1900, it's almost like they just throw everything in. You see the buildings in London, they got a bit of Gothic and a bit of this and a bit of Baroque and a bit of Renaissance and so on. It just becomes kind of the whole thing is on overdrive. The tiny little image of the building up in the corner you should find interesting. It's the Congregational Church in Queechee, which is a little village. It's got an Indian name in Vermont, and it is Gothic Revival. So it was built in 1871. Now this you should find interesting because up until a year ago, you were, even if you didn't know it, you were worshipping in a Gothic Revival building. King Street was Gothic. Frankly, not very good Gothic. The real Gothic was the parish church next door. That was the medieval version that was half decent. We were the cheap Baptist version. Baptists didn't even want to touch Gothic because they thought it was too Anglican and Catholic. And then eventually we became very middle class and anything you can do, I can do better. So if the Anglicans are going to, the Methodists went first, they capitulated early, and then the Baptists run along behind. And if you go to actually Baptist Church House, which I've done, it's full of adverts for new Baptist churches, and they all look the same. You see the one in Market Harborough, and there's facsimile copies all over the country. It was like you went to IKEA catalogue and you just had them ordered. But they're Gothic, so they must be a real church. And what drives you bonkers is even now, solid pagans feel they haven't been to church unless they went into a Gothic building. You get this with weddings. I wouldn't want to get married in Springwell because it looks like a kind of a town hall. But I'd want to be married in the parish church because it's got a spire, it's got stained glass, it's got pointed arches. So that Gothic thing began to then revisit. Okay, so a few further observations. I hope this is not too technical. Right, let's come to Scripture. So, tabernacle. Anybody tell me, what was the tabernacle? Brian is itching to define the tabernacle.
The tent of meeting that was set up by Moses.
Good. Yeah. Right. Why did they think God was there?
Why did what?
Why did they think God was in the tent of meeting? Why did the Israelites think that God was in the tent of meeting?
Well, he came down upon it in a cloud.
Shekinah, yeah.
Shekinah glory, yes.
And what else?
I think only Moses went in, came out, and his face was shining.
But there's something else, right? Aaron at the front? Come on, go for it, theology student.
Stop it. The Ark of the Covenant.
Ark of the Covenant. Ark of the Covenant represents the localized presence of God. So the tabernacle was, in a sense, the house of God because he actually lived there. He was in the box, bluntly. His presence was in the box. So then when the temple is built, it is truly the house of God. Why? Because the Ark of the Covenant is there. The Shekinah turns up, doesn't it? When they pray for the dedication of the temple with Solomon, then the Shekinah is there. So that is the Old Testament's view. However, we now have synagogues. So, simple question. Any reference to synagogues in the Old Testament? Yes or no? And everybody looks, I haven't thought about that. Yes or no?
Yeah.
Does the word synagogue appear in the Old Testament? No. Synagogues are not referred to. Now, the simple the reason is because they appear in the time after the exile. And they are localized expressions. They're much more like our churches, where people met to learn scriptures and to pray and to worship and to fellowship together. But they are not described in the Old Testament. Hang on, I'm not quite there yet. And they are described in the New Testament. So in the New Testament, right, again, I'm going to put you on the spot. So, right, John 4, Jesus has something interesting to say about where and how we should worship in a conversation with the woman of Samaria. She says, I can't do your stuff because I'm a Samaritan and I meet on Mount Gerizim. And he says in response, what? This is very important. Go on, Alan, come on.
There's going to come a time when you will worship neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but those who worship will worship in spirit and in truth.
Amen. So that means holy buildings, and we need to keep gently reminding our Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican friends of this, holy buildings is Old Testament. I say it again, according to the Bible, holy buildings are Old Testament. Now, it's holy worship, and as you worship, that defines that space as holy, which is very different. So then Acts 2 and verse 46, at the end of the day of Pentecost, then Luke says they met in the temple courts. They weren't that bothered about going into the main building for the sacrifices. They met in the temple courts to pray in larger groups, we presume, and in homes. Philemon 2, directly there's a greeting from Paul to the house of the church that meets in your house. And 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, again a question, we are described as living something. What? Living what? You can shout it out. What's that? Stones. We are the house of God. We are the house of God. So the New Testament sets a very different landscape. And so irrespective of all the stuff that we've thought about or still are to consider, if we are people of the Scriptures, this has to set how we understand, frankly, what this building is. So I give you full right. Next time that you're in a Baptist meeting, Baptist prayer meeting, and somebody says, we are gathered here in the house of God, and just say, excuse me, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? We are the house of God. This is not the house of God. There is no ark. We might experience Shekinah, but that Shekinah could be anywhere. We worship God in spirit and truth. This is not the house of God, according to Scripture. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't meet God here, but, and I'm not trying to be facetious, you could meet God powerfully in the toilet in this building. You could have a better divine revelation of him there than you might even do here if God chooses to do it. Or even the car park, or even in Co-op's car park, because God is everywhere. You can ask a question. Microphone to Mr. Bent.
So when you say this isn't the house of God, I'm guessing you're referring to the building itself.
The building.
But when you say this isn't the house of God, you're not saying that God doesn't have authority.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Making sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would like to say to you, and you can challenge me later on this, I think that's what's so exciting about the New Testament. The Old Testament is about holy people, the priests. The Old Testament is about holy places, the temple. Now, everything is holy. I'm no priest, you're priests, and we're all priests together. This is a space where we meet God, and you meet God in your own living room, just as powerfully. That doesn't mean you should stay there and not meet with us, because we are, in a way, with a temple. So as we meet bodily, God's presence increases. This building is not holy, I would say, some Anglicans would disagree, in and of itself, because it's a consecrated space. And the interesting thing is, and one of the books I was reading says there is a quantitative difference between a building which is being used for its purpose and worship is happening there, and a building in and of itself. Now, I give you a simple illustration of this. One of the churches I went to, which I'm going to show in a moment, I was really concerned because it's a very famous building now, and I was, you know what it's like when there's just coach parties everywhere now, and COVID's over, so everybody's gone bonkers, even like me, running around Europe. And we were at one particular castle, and I could hear the guide say very loudly to her group, who were all Americans, they were talking at the tops of their voices, bless them, well, we're going to be at this church tomorrow, and I'm thinking, oh, crumbs, we'll be there, and it'll be like a circus, and people doing bunny pictures in front of the high altar and all the rest of it. And when we rolled into this glorious space, it was like we walked into a service. Why? Because there was a French Catholic pilgrimage group who were there, and they were sitting waiting for their soloist to sing. And then she struck up. You could hear a pin drop in the place. Everybody came in, put the cameras away, and just stood there. And she sang Jesu Joy Man's Desiring. And then from Handel's Messiah, I know that my Redeemer liveth. My mate burst into tears. The Holy Spirit fell. And it was not a building anymore. It was an experience of worship. But not because it's a beautiful building, but because there was a beauty of worship in that space. Let's go on to the next slide. I touched on this before, and I know it's a little technical, but I think it's interesting. How do we define a building? How do we evaluate a building? Some of you know I studied at university about 3 million years ago under a guy called J.G. Davis, who was a church architecture specialist. So I'm now representing his book and his thoughts. He said you could define church buildings under two Latin terms, Domus Dei, house of God, Domus Ecclesiae, the house of the church. I recently, to try and be creative and a bit of a smart aleck, have also added Domus Civitas, because we were having a discussion about what this building is, which means house of the community. Now, this is an interesting exercise, and I haven't read anything definitive about it, so I'm just putting this out, and then we're going to move on. I have a theory. So, in the medieval period, think of the church in Whetstone, main church building for the whole village. It was 1, 2, and 3. It was primarily the house of God. It was sanctified. It was viewed as a holy space. There was a sense whereby they were leaning back into the theology of the Old Testament temple, which we're not happy with maybe, but still there's that. But it was also where the people in the village met. In fact, to be honest, I suspect that the whole of Whetstone went to that village church at some point. In fact, it was almost obligatory, not an option. But it wasn't just that the whole village went. Everybody else turned up, even, sheep and everything else. Because what we forget is in the medieval period, these buildings operated as centers for the whole community. If you could believe it, in Old St. Paul's, and J.G. Davis has a whole chapter on this, in Old St. Paul's, that's the building that burnt down in the Great Fire, the original St. Paul's, the central nave was called Paul's Walk. And during the day, it was full of people. There were people selling things. There were people doing entertainment. There were people promenading up and down. It was the place to be seen. There were politicians and merchants meeting one another to discuss business. Now, some of the church authorities weren't entirely happy about this, but I find that absolutely extraordinary. This was the whole of the community doing their stuff in that space. So don't forget that even if we go back to the medieval period, they had this very high view. This is God's house. It was also everybody else's house as well. Reformation, Catholic Church comes to an end in Britain. Things change. Seems to me what you get after the Reformation with Anglicans and Catholics, the building becomes one and two. Domus Dei, it is the house of God. Big emphasis. Domus Ecclesiae, it's where the church meet, but the community, you read it, it all tailed off in the 17th century. No selling, no buying, no drinking, no chatting. It's a holy space. And so therefore, it's not really for the communities at all. What happens also is our lot emerge, the hardcore prots, the nonconformists. I mean, you think, we know the Bible, we know it's not the house of God, so it is the house of the church, but we also might let it be used for the community. So it's two and sometimes three. And then what has happened in the 20th century is Anglicans have changed again, I would suggest, and they're doing 1, 2, and 3. So this is like God's house, and then maybe, perhaps in the new building, we might draw it across, and then we have messy church, and we may not even have messy church, but horror of horrors, slimming world, and just nothing to do with God, or even worse still, we might even actually have hustings for the local authority. So there is that drifting, and one of the things I think we still need to grapple with, and I'm not sure we're quite there, is what are we? We're not Domus Dei. If we are, I think me and Sim will resign, because we are not Catholics, and this is not, as we keep telling you, biblically a holy space, but we're certainly two, and to what extent are we three? Let's go on to the next slide. Right, this is a little bit more complicated. Wish through this. So some of the reading that I did, one writer said you can assess buildings by these different criteria. I find this very interesting. Spatial dynamic. In other words, how the seating is configured, how you relate to the person who's at the front. Is there a band? Is there a choir? What is the interface? If it's the type of church, do people process in? Do they process out? Do they process around? What does the movement of people interrelate to the building? Quite often, you see a lot of churches and you think, this is really weird, it's so long. Well, you know why it's long? It's because they're walking up and down. I mean, you've just seen all these royal funerals. All they're doing is walking around, isn't it? And here comes Rishi Sunak and somebody, here comes Liz Truss, which the Australians didn't even recognize, So, people just passing through. I mean, she wasn't around for long anyway, but, at least they could have recognized it was the Prime Minister. But they're all kind of walking in, and then they're taking their seats, and then they're walking back out, and then somebody goes here and somebody goes there. It's all about spatial dynamics in a cathedral. It's a lot of moving around, and the building is designed to facilitate that. So if you're looking at it statically, we're kind of missing what's going on. Central focus. What is everybody looking at? Now here, we're looking at the cross. That's no accident, we know that. Gareth was keen for that, as the rest of us were. Many Baptist churches, you're looking at a pulpit. Sometimes the joke used to be that the Catholics, they look into the cross, and Baptists are looking to the organ. Because the biggest thing at the front is the organ, So, thinking like, that's not intentional, but why is the organ right there? I mean, it could be at the sides, So the point is, in the end, what is the central focus? What is everybody looking at? What does that mean? Aesthetic impact. Is there beauty? And if there is beauty, what is it trying to convey? The reason why people who aren't Christians like church buildings is because they're beautiful, And it makes them think about God. Because they come in and they think, and it's interesting, I've been doing this. You walk in and they're talking loudly and then suddenly they go hushed. Nobody was even telling them to be quiet. It's like, I'm in the holy place. Oh, look, and look, and look. You know. And somehow they're engaging with the beauty, the aesthetics, which is then maybe taking them into what the building is about. But also it might be with the wrong idea, we would say, for the nature of the space. Thinking God's here, but he's not outside. Fourthly, symbolic resonance. What is being represented in the symbolism? Now, you might say, you look at this building, there isn't any symbolism. Well, actually, if there isn't any symbolism, that's symbolic. You know, I mean, because actually most Baptist buildings are so plain that you could think there was something else. That's not an accident. In the same way that when you go into a Catholic church, it's death by detail quite often. That's no accident. Or it's gloomy and mystical, and you think, like, why don't you switch the lights on? The lights are not going to go on because it is the light in the place is supposed to be symbolic. So the fact that we are in a large vacuum with very little detail is no accident. That is symbolic. Or maybe the things that we do have, the cross, is symbolic. Or maybe, interestingly, there are symbols of our faith, not necessarily of God, or even symbols of our journey as a people. You do realize that almost the first thing that we put up in this building, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, connecting back to King Street, were the war memorials. I mean, the First and Second World War was a long time ago. I'm sure the vast majority of this congregation, even though there's a Shenton on there, I can't imagine all the Shentons in this area are one enormous family. You know, we all know these people, but they're part of our journey. You see, walking into a church building is stepping into a story. It's not just a story about God or faith, it's actually a story about those people and the people who were there before those people. Right. So, actually, we're making very good time. You don't know where I'm at, but I'm working my way through. So I'm trying to keep a good pace because I don't want you to get bored to death. So we've got 5 case studies. I'm not going to spend ages on these. And if you've got questions, give me a shout. And this is just to give, and then I land it with some comments about here. So, first one, Selby Abbey, which is also in Yorkshire. So what you've got on there is, first of all, you have a plan, and then you have some old photographs. So first of all, the reason why I chose this building, they're all slightly different. This is a monastic building. Very simple question. I'm sure somebody can say, what is a monastery? What defines a monastery? Anyone? Yeah, Trish. It has a company of monks. So there are people who are based there, who live there all the time, and who are involved in worship and sometimes service to the community. Most of our large medieval buildings in Britain were monastic. The reason why Richard III was under the car park is because there was a building called Greyfriars that was there, which was then demolished. It was a monastery, and that's why he ended up being buried there near the high altar. So these buildings are all over Britain. The monks were all booted out by which king? Henry VIII in about 1538. Some of them became cathedrals. Chester, Gloucester, some of these were upgraded, and new dioceses were constructed, but others simply became bonkers big parish churches, far bigger than you really need. Think of that, for example, if you go to Tewkesbury Abbey is enormous. It's practically, in Tewkesbury, it's the only thing that doesn't flood. If you remember, you see these lovely maps whenever Tewkesbury floods, there's a little abbey, smart Saxons, they built it on the only hill in the town, and the rest of the town is a duck pond. So, but that church became then simply no more than a parish church. And this happened at Selby. Notice the layout. What does the layout look like? Anyone? What shape is it? It's a cross. It's a cross. Very simple point. It's a cruciform cross. So you have a nave at the bottom, north transept, south transept, a central tower, which is often the case, 2 towers at the west end, and then beyond it you have a choir and chancel, east end. Another simple question. Why do medieval churches face east? They're looking towards Skegness. It is. It's very much that Jesus will return from the east, and Jerusalem, of course, is in the east. So almost all churches, in fact, I'm pretty sure we can go through them. Whetstone must be facing east. East is that way. So Broughton Astley is the same. So we don't think about this, but the shape of the building is a cross. It's a statement about the Christian faith. And the very direction, the orientation of the building is a statement about it. And this, as you can see, is a Gothic building. Now, the problem is these buildings were neglected, and so they had a habit of falling down. And this is not, it happens in lots of places. Selby was no exception. So the tower, Central Tower, fell down in 1690. And if you have a look at the top picture, you can see that the tower is a bit rubbish. Even all the people who write the guidebooks say it was modest. In other words, it was rubbish. They didn't have much money. It was a town in Yorkshire without a great deal of wealth. We'll just shove something up to fill the gap. And then, horror of horrors, in 1906, the whole place burned down. There was a fire started at the choir and went all the way through. Have the next slide. So they weren't quite sure what to do, but they got a guy called Aldridge Scott to rebuild the place in a Gothic style. And of course, at that sort of point, they weren't, there wasn't English Heritage, 85 committees, every single thing had to be, the original tiles. They decided, well, actually, we'll spruce it up a bit at the same time. We'll give it a bit of a makeover. And so if you notice, the new tower in the middle looks surprisingly medieval, and it's Edwardian. And the two towers at the end have been heightened. So when you go to Selby and say it's a wonderful example of medieval architecture, it is, but it's also a lot of Edwardian additions. And a beautiful roof. It's gorgeous, as you can see inside. And it is a regional church. Some of these big parish churches, Catholic, now Anglican, are being called minsters. So if you go to Croydon, for example, Croydon Parish Church, it was always just like Croydon Parish Church, and now it's Croydon Minster. And they've been kind of upgraded because they're quite big, and they have, if you like, more responsibility within the diocese. Selby, I think, has that responsibility, not just for the parish, but for the town. So it's a regional Anglican church, formerly Catholic, but it's not a cathedral. Next case study, Karlskirche in Vienna. This couldn't be any different. So, the layout. This building was built in the early 18th century. You'll all know that Europe went through horrors in terms of various forms of the bubonic plague. 1666 in London, classically over in Derbyshire, you remember at Eyam, where incredibly the village was quarantined by the parish minister. Lots of experience. 1713, 8,000 people, it's a lot of people, died in Vienna. The Emperor, Charles VI, decided that since they'd got through this, and as a memorial to those who died, but also to represent his court and the Austrian Empire, he had this building built. And that's why it's called the Karlskirche, in German, Charles Church. If we have and you can see it's centralized. So although there's the two-room plan, the chancel's tiny, if you notice, really. There's nobody really you couldn't get a choir or anything in there. But the main thing is actually a central church under a dome. They began to move away, 16th, 17th century, to be a little bit more centralized. In fact, this is just an interesting aside, that's what Christopher Wren wanted to do with St. Paul's. And the Anglicans, who can be sometimes reliable to be creatures of habit, said, no, we can't possibly have that. It looks far too Catholic, and we want a long nave in front. And so then the whole thing was changed. If you go into St. Paul's, there's a wooden model of the original layout up in the roof, which is worth seeing. Okay, so the next image. So this is the Karlskirche. What an interesting building. I think it's the most extraordinary church in Vienna. And you'll notice a few things. First of all, look at the portico on the front. I mean, that could be on the front of a Greek temple. I mean, it's not that different from Nîmes, really. It's a direct lift. But the columns, now I'm looking at Tristan because he goes to Rome this weekend. You'll see those columns because Trajan's column is very close to that in design. So that's a Roman motif. And yet also the dome is a Baroque thing because you wouldn't have seen anything like that, really, in Greek or Roman architecture. So, yeah.
There's a copy of those columns in the V&A Museum.
There is. Yes, you're right. There is. So this was, if you like, this is a different style of church. So we had a monastery. Now this is a royal church. And so basically what the king wanted to do was establish a place where his court could meet, and it would represent the Austrian Empire. So we have the next slide. So if you look, I mean, it is quite extraordinary. And in fact, at the moment, there's an artificial lift, well, there's a lift that's been put in, which takes you right into the dome. I had to have it behind me. It's only there for a little while longer, but when they restored the inside, they put in this lift. I've never seen it anywhere else. So it takes you right inside the dome. So you could almost reach out and touch the dome, ever so high. If you suffer, John Adams is shaking his head, if you suffer from vertigo, you would not want to do it. Somebody did it just before me, and they got to the top of the lift and stuck their head out and went straight back down again, because it's a little, if you like, canopy on the top. Please notice just about, you can only just see it, over here, you can see either side, there looks like windows. Can you see either side, with like all sash windows on either side? That's where the emperor sat. So he was perfectly secure. So he'd wander in from his palace, I'm here, gaze out through the window, at the riffraff, and then disappear again. So it's a state church. He described this place as a votive. It's almost like an offering to God on behalf of the whole empire. The most extraordinary thing, it looks vast, doesn't it? It seats 250 people. It's less than us. But the building is enormous. So it has a small imprint and a massive uplift. And that's what some of these buildings are. They're big statements, So I find that quite extraordinary, really. I almost felt like saying that represents unconsciously Austria. I mean, it's a titchy little place. I mean, when the Austrian Empire fell apart, they ended up with Vienna, Salzburg, and a couple of mountains. I mean, really, Austria, was running most of Europe, but Austria itself is a tiny place. And I think actually it did represent the empire, a much bigger thing than it really was. But that was not their intention. That's just my reading of it from a psychological point of view. The third study, and we've already touched on this before, Wieskirche. I would say to you, I've been to this church now about 4 times, and I know Rococo, which is the final is a bit much. In fact, it's not a bit much, it's a lot much. And so some people walk in and think, it's just like somebody has gone insane in this building. And, it's like, there was nowhere else to paint or put sculptures or put statues. It's just absolutely in your face in every sense. But it is extraordinary. And some of them are gaudy. I would say this one, it is very in your face, but it's also, there's a sublimeness to it, the colors and interface. So we look at the plan. Again, it's centralized. You can see there's a little bit more of a defined chancel at the end, but really it's a large circle. Of the next image, this church, and that illustrates it, is completely in the middle of nowhere. It is totally the middle of nowhere. So if you look for DVs, the village which it lives in, you won't even find it at most maps. So what the hell is this church doing there? This is a pilgrimage church. We've done a monastic church, a royal church, and now this is a pilgrimage church. People went to it and they found the church rather than church was sited for them. So they went looking for the church. Why did they do this? In the early 1700s, the abbey, nearby abbey, Steingarten, put a statue together. I think this is a rather funny story. And they put it together, but everybody thought it was a bit rubbish. Because Catholics often walk in processions with these statues on Good Friday if it's of Jesus on the cross. And they actually didn't, the guy who did it didn't do it terribly well. It was kind of like the IKEA version of statues. So they really didn't like it. So guess what they did? They shoved it in the pub. The monastery had a pub in the town, and they just said, we'll put it in the back of the pub. And the niece of the landlord said, I quite like that. I'm going to take it back to my farm, Maria Lois. And so her farm was in this village. Let me try I get this right, on the 14th of June, 1738, guess what happened? She thought she saw tears running down the statue's face. Now, for those of you who remember Only Fools and Horses, this sort of thing can regularly happen if you have a leak anywhere near a statue and it is not divine, but it might be still very prudent for finances. We don't necessarily need to completely buy into the cynicism, but Maria was deeply moved, and so the Catholic authorities decided to build a church by the farm, and then people would come to worship the scourged Savior. So we look at the interior. Now, you might not be able to quite see it, but the statue is there. Can you see it just above the high altar? In the alcove, that's still the statue from the original procession, the one that was due to be weeping. It is an extraordinary building. There were two brothers called Dominikus Zimmermann and John Baptiste Zimmermann, the Zimmermann brothers. And in southern Germany, they are considered to be the kind of the uber Rococo performers. You know, they are the ultimate people. And Zimmermann's buildings are quite something. The thing I have to say I really like about this building, apart from the fact, obviously, can you imagine sitting in that space, by the way, and listening to I Know That My Redeemer Liveth, played from the back gallery? You know, I mean, it is a space like that, which is then filled with spiritual music, can be incredibly evocative. But look at the ceiling. What can you notice? The door to eternal life. So the people who are not concentrating, but just gazing away, they're looking at the fact there's a door, and you better go through it. And I'm thinking, actually, I've got a lot for that. I mean, maybe we could paint it up there. So when they're looking, thinking, by the way, the only door that you need to go through when you leave this building is the one up there, which is basically, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except by me. I've never seen such and it's massive. You can imagine how big it is with the scale of that ceiling. And it's a huge statement. And of course, it's symbolism again, isn't it? We talk about the cross, but I think a door is more evocative because people wonder, what is that door about? Fifth and last case study. We're getting there. Fourth, Lyme Congregational, New Hampshire. And the plan? Now, this isn't the plan, as you can see, of Lyme. This is of a congregational chapel in Walpole in Suffolk. But it is a plan that a lot of you will recognize because we've all been there. A little nonconformist chapel with galleries on three sides and a central pulpit. And Lyme is a variation on that. So when it was built, we had the next image, in 1810, so for America, that's really early. I mean, just after the Revolutionary War. This is in Lyme. It's a village in upstate New Hampshire, close to the Vermont border. And you can see it's a beautiful building, some limited classical details, give it a slightly Georgian feel. And the layout of this building, when built in 1810, was gallery, 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 pews on all levels, big central pulpit, and a communion table in front. Now, if you notice, that is not what you see in the corner. 1871, they put a floor in at gallery level. Now, this has happened in many churches. It's happened at Willesden Green. It's happened in many nonconformist churches in Britain where the church was simply too big, and the easiest way to manage it was put a floor in at gallery level, use the gallery stairs to get in there, and to then have a flat space. But interestingly, if you look at the front, right, you can shout this out. What's the central focus? What's the central focus in the inside? What are people really looking at? I know it's a small image. What's underneath the cross? There is a cross. Sorry? There's a Bible, but what is the Bible sitting on? It's an altar. It's an altar. See, what happened is, as Congregationalists there and here went on the journey, and the Methodists, the pulpit got moved to the side, and they think, actually, we're going to be a bit more Anglican. We ain't just going to put up a Gothic building, but we'll actually put an altar in as well, which they would never have had. Originally, there would have been a big pulpit. The pulpit's now at the side. See, do you see what I'm saying? The position of things is important. It's saying something about the priorities of that church. Whether we agree with them or disagree with them, if you put a pulpit far at the side, it's kind of saying this is less significant. If you have a lectern even here, it's saying the preaching of the word is important. It's central. I know Lyme quite well, and I think this is a helpful anecdote. And I went there with my friends, and you can never get in these places. You know, even in the fall, you thought they could have been, I don't know, serving pumpkin soup or something, but nothing was open, and it's a small village. So I said to my friend, we're going to have to go back there on the Sunday, see where I'm going to get in. Bless them, I came in. They used to have a congregation of 50 before COVID. Now they had 15. We are not normal. We have survived COVID almost with our numbers intact. All over the place, places have shut. Can you believe it? I was even talking to a pastor in London the weekend. The mosque in Norbury is closing because it hasn't recovered from COVID. So the impact of COVID has been huge, especially in some communities with a lot of elderly people. So there was only 15 of them there, and that was including me and my friend. So when I said I was interested in the history of the building, it was lucky that I actually got out in time to fly home. So not least because, you can imagine this is America. We haven't got a lot of history, so we're going to make a lot of it. You know what America's like. So the guy who was actually the head of the Historical Society, I kid you not, took me up into the belfry. I saw the wooden roof. I saw the bell. I nearly concussed myself on a tiny little ladder. Health and safety was out of the window. One of the other interesting things that he told me, and this I want to share with you because I think it might have some bearing on us. This church is well known in New Hampshire because it has a set of carriages. I should have had them. They're around the other side of the church. I had a picture of them with names on. And I always used to think that it's very unusual. They've largely disappeared in other churches. They had them with names above. And I thought people, they would come. It's like your parking spot. It's like pastors, where you drive in, leave your car, leave your carriage, leave the horses, and then go in and take the service and come back. No, they were rented out. It was a set of garages that they rented out. And next to it is a little house that they also rented out to an undertaker who was in partnership with the church, who actually dealt with their dead and organized the burials. And because it was the biggest building in the village, sound familiar, the biggest meeting place in the village, the town council met there for 150 years until after the Second World War. It was, and the library for the community met in one of the downstairs rooms. So almost anything that was anything in terms of rented space, in terms of undertakers, in terms of libraries, in terms of town meetings, it all happened there. It was Dominus Ecclesia, but it was also Domus Civitas. Last case study, Coventry Cathedral. So this is the plan, and I'm hoping that some of you will know something about Coventry. So there are the ruins of the former cathedral that was bombed in the war and the new building next door. What you will notice, if we go back to the plan, again, the building is mainly cruciform. There are some very interesting rude comments about how badly planned this medieval building was, which you don't need to know about, but they're fairly entertaining. But leaving that side, it was a good-looking building, but the interior planning was a complete joke. So it's loosely cruciform. And then the other building, interestingly not bothered about east-west, is the new cathedral, which is built on. And then you can just see in the background something faint. I wonder how many of you knew that there were 3 cathedrals in Coventry. So there was a building called St. Mary's Priory that was monastic, like Selby, and became the cathedral of the Coventry Diocese, which was also twinned with the Lichfield Diocese. There's a very long, complicated, and incredibly boring story about how these two dioceses have fought with each other, tried to outnumber each other and outmaneuver each other, and then eventually separate and become distinct. So St. Mary's was a cathedral. Incredibly, at the centre of Coventry, if you could imagine it, in about 1500, there were 3 enormous churches, all within spitting distance of one another. So St. Mary's, the previous cathedral with a huge spire. The spire, by the way, is 295 feet high. What you don't realise, Coventry doesn't sell itself so much sometimes, it's, I think, the second highest spire in Britain. 303 feet is Salisbury, so it's right up there. It's in the top 2 or 3. It's a massive building. Also, behind it is Holy Trinity with another big spire, and then there was St. Mary's, which apparently had 3 spires. So there were 5 spires on 3 buildings in the middle of Coventry. Who could imagine that Coventry at one point was so holy? So let's move on to the next slide. So that's the old building, St. Michael's, which was a parish church. The reason why it's so grand is because there was loads of money in Coventry at the end of the medieval period because of wool production and so on. And you can see that in the Guildhall, which has been recently restored. And obviously the scale of the building indicates it was built in the 1450s. But this was bombed. Remember, there was the lightning raid on Coventry that took out a lot of the town centre in 1940. The cathedral had been upgraded to a cathedral in 1918. If you remember, a lot of towns that didn't have a diocese got a diocese. Birmingham, you've got St. Philip's Cathedral in the middle. Manchester, a lot of these places, their parish church was upgraded. And so that's what happened to this place, but it didn't last for very long. Next image. So what you now get is the current building, which was built in the 1950s, finished in 1962 by Sir Basil Spence. And as you can see, it's a much bigger space. It's a rectangular space. And the interesting thing is, and it's not to everybody's taste, some people have said it's like, it's art gallery meets cathedral. It was like anyone who was anyone, did some designs. I would imagine if, Coventry Cathedral had been built in 1990, you'd have Tracy Emin leaving sort of a partly disorganized bed in the corner. I mean, everybody did something. So Jacob Epstein did the statue outside of St. Michael and the devil. John Piper, who did the glass in the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool, he did the glass in the baptistry. And incredibly, the tapestry at the front by Sir Graham Sutherland is the largest woven tapestry in the world. But again, it was interesting. I was there a couple of Sunday afternoons ago. It was interesting seeing people come into it. Coventry is a very eclectic place. It's a large multicultural city. And I thought a lot of these people are coming in. I mean, I'm not sure whether they're practicing Christians. There were people taking pictures, but there were simply just people walking around with a sense of awe and a sense of ownership. We live in Coventry and this is ours. It's special. So it's very interesting. This is the last of the case studies, but it's a cathedral that's really owned by its community. A few things as we finish. I tried to keep to an hour, and I'm nearly there. Yep. Haven't entirely glazed over. I did a master's in church architecture for my sins in 2003, and these are observations I made about what a building should have from our perspective. We're talking about free church, biblically orientated Christians. It needs to have accessibility, it needs to be welcoming. It needs to have simplicity. In other words, we're not saying this is the place to worship God, nowhere else matters. There should be creativity, there should be an expression of creative skills, there should be a sense of community, a gatheredness, there should be visibility to what's happening, audibility to what's happening, transparency about what we believe, and adaptability about the nature of our space. So, how does Whetstone fare on those? Accessibility, let's be honest, that corridor was amazing. I mean, when you think at King Street, it couldn't be any worse. I mean, as you walked in, you were colliding with the back of the people who were already arriving, or the communion table. The toilet door, if you remember on the side, it was like climbing into a cupboard. I mean, the whole sense of a welcome space was completely lost. And when you got inside the toilet, you thought you wanted to get out quickly because it looked like it'd been built, in about 1880. So the thing was, I'm parodying it, but it couldn't be any worse. A lot of churches are like that, really. You can't. Anglicans are generally not, but some of our nonconformist chapels, the welcome space is dreadful. And King Street was really bad, and this is superb. Again, this big open space, but even as you come in, there's this huge, welcoming, light atrium. Simplicity, well, looking around, I don't think this could be any more simple. I mean, really, it's, dare I say, simple bordering on bleak. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, I'm looking out. I can see Mike Shenton, who looks glorious. I can see top of Rob's head. It's looking not bad. I can see a screen. I can see the inevitable pile of books and some plastic containers, some seats, and a view through to something else. I'm being a little bit facetious. We're being very facetious. The point is, we've gone deliberately. It's not an accident. We've gone for a simple space. It does highlight this. Maybe we also could think, is there also a possibility, going on to the next one, of some other creativity? I know we have talked about good Christian art, maybe banners which are well made, which have got real quality to them, both in terms of, we're not going to get the equivalent of Graham Sutherland's, but something which is really good, not thrown together, and also something which has a strong message. But the simplicity doesn't need to be at the cost of creativity, so we're kind of somewhere in between, I would suggest. Community. King Street is the usual Baptist thing. You're all sat in uncomfortable seats looking at the back of someone's head. That's what non-conformist chapels do. And some Anglicans, up, down, head. And if you've got a lady with a big hat or a man who's been stretched just after he's been born, best of luck for seeing anything else. So, but in this space, this is gathered. We have an arc of seating, so you can actually see each other as well as see what's going on in the front. So in that sense, there is a sense of community in the way that we seat. However, let me put it out there, we could be more experimental. Some Catholic churches have been experimenting with completely in the round. I don't think we could do that regularly, and our stage isn't that helpful for that, but there's enough space there to gather at least 100 or so people in a complete circle, say if you wanted to have communion in a very different way. There is some possibility because of the flexibility of our seating arrangements. Visibility, most of us are able to see easily, but there is an issue with the gallery. Audibility, our acoustics are a little live. Generally, audibility is very good in here, but sometimes it can reverberate. Transparency, we're nearly there. Where is the baptistry? The point is, you go into a Baptist church and you have no idea where the baptistry is. No idea at all. Douglas McBain, my late mentor, he wrote about this and he said, interestingly, he said, and I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, in American churches, they have it up on the wall. I remember being in one Baptist church in the States, and it was like a goldfish bowl. I felt like saying, and you literally saw the pastor walk in, you could see the whole thing in 3D, thinking like, you need to make sure that you're well wrapped up as the candidate, and I thought you could have put a few fish in there to make it interesting. But, you see the whole thing up on the wall. Now, that's a bit extreme, but in some 19th century Baptist churches in Britain, there would be a properly arranged baptistry at the front with maybe some rails around. And Douglas McBain observed that in Scandinavian Baptist churches, they've often experimented with that. He says, are we embarrassed? I think it's mainly expediency. But I do think sometimes it's weird. We're called Baptists. And you come in and there's no evidence of how somebody even could be baptized, apart from in a baptism service. And lastly, adaptability. And here Phil skates out on thin ice. So we do have a fairly adaptable space. One problem, this. It's good, but it takes up a huge amount of space. And if you wanted to use this space for something else, you've got to factor in that maybe a quarter of the space is raised. Secondly, great as it is, we have carpet. Does that mean we can't have food? We can't have meals? Certain meetings in here, Slimming World is fine. They're not allowed to eat. They're supposed to be cutting down. But, if we actually had a meal, would that be a problem or an issue? Then we say, but Philip, you don't need to go there because we've got the hall when we've finished it. Does that then mean that we're going back to this is Domus Dei? Oh, it's the Baptist house of God. Slimming World, they need to go upstairs because it's not real church. Welcome to the Catholic Church. We'll introduce you to the Pope when you've sorted out your spirituality. This is still a space. Now, this is not a sanctified space. This is where we meet. But if we're serious about Domus Civitas, what's the problem with political hustings happening here? We had that at Streatham. Other things to do with the community. The town meetings, going back to Lyme. There are things for us to grapple with. But I do think, and I've tried to land it in this way, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about is not just fancy buildings in Germany. It's about what is this building and how are we going to use it.